I was told to keep the exhibition public friendly. And, you know, photography and photographs are very difficult things to actually work with, to think through. And as Giles said, it's only in the last 40 years that there are some theoretical stuff on photography and photographic collections from India has been coming up. But these archives, when each of them they come to us, or one studies these archives, you open these archives, new questions come up. And I think some of them, I mean, for example, the Alkazi archive and the DAG archive, they might have similar things to some extent, but the whole histories of archiving would actually throw up different questions. So there is a lot which one can do with photographs, and I'm just hoping that the youngsters, I mean, you know, the young people amongst you would be encouraged to work with historical photographs, because they actually tell us about the ways in which we historicize discipline. So I just want to begin with that, and then just take a spiel through what this exhibition is about. What it is about is literally the connected history of photography and the architectural surveys of India, which created a sense of Indian archaeology, because archaeology and architecture were not two very different things in the 19th century. They both came from antiquarian field surveys. And the first slide is, of course, Deen Dayal, but I just want you to note the two kind of quotes. So one is from the British Journal of Photography. It's by John Henderson, in fact, saying that when photography came, photography was something which could actually take photographs. The nature was allowed to take photograph, and there was nothing of the human hand or the human mind which went into creating an image. The other one, as you can see, one is 1860, and I mean, there is also another one by John Henderson in 1868. The other one is 2008, and that's Ariel Azule, who talks in terms of a civil contract of photography. And you can see through the quote that things are a little more complicated than how they kind of received photography for documenting in the 19th century. The next slide, or where is, yeah. So the first thing, which I just want to, before we go into photography and archaeology, just going to give a really very quick history about the Antiquarian Survey, which begins perhaps around the 16th century recorded. And William Stukely, who was the first secretary of the Society of Antiquities in London, he said, and I just quote, "Without drawing or designing, the study of antiquities or any other science is lame and imperfect." And so you can figure out that visualization, vision, seeing, knowing the field has been a part of field surveys. And one of the first, perhaps one of the early paintings of Indian landscape, or the ones which one can consider as an antiquarian one, are the ones which is by Hodges, William Hodges, who came to India 1781, 1783, and followed by the Daniels, uncle and nephew, Thomas and William. And there is a very rich collection of both at the DAG archive, and these are, in a way, the picturesque representing accuracy. Because William Hodges also noted that his paintings represented plain observations noted in the simple garb of truth, without the smallest embellishment from fiction or from fancy. But we do know that many, not in this, but many paintings of Hodges, that the parts of the buildings he actually rearranged. The next slide. The thing about continuing the history of antiquary, and again, this is a very simple history I'm drawing for you because I'm eliminating many. But we can pick up on somebody called Colin Mackenzie, who was the Surveyor General of India between 1815 and 1821. But he arrived in Madras in 1783. He took up position with the East India Company, and after the fall of Tipu Sultan, he was actually in the force which defeated Tipu. He was sent to survey southern India for revenue purposes, but he surveyed India. And as he says, I mean, this survey, and the other one is a survey of the Qutub Minar taken by James Blunt, and the information is in the Asiatic Researches. And if you actually look at the pages of the Asiatic Researches, which you all can, because it's in the archive.org, you would see that the next page is literally full of equations. You know, so the whole thing was to kind of show that what I have seen, what its measurements, its equation, it is literally transcribing something which has been seen, something which has been measured by trigonometry, not by climbing up the kutub or taking any scales, by showing them to have an accurate representation. However, seeing was always not knowing, because Mackenzie, for example, when he goes and surveys a temple on the river, as he says, Krishna, which would be Krishna, calls the river Peruvattam. I do not know what temple that would be. He asks the Brahmins to show how the gods, to show or tell him what the sculptures on the exterior of the temples meant. And the Brahmin said, this shows how our gods live above. At which point Mackenzie quipped, but indeed they seem to have lost all traces of any knowledge they may have formerly possessed and have sunk into the profoundest state of ignorance. Now for Mackenzie, the value of the temple lay in its agency as a historical source. For the Brahmins, the temple constituted the present, alive with the presence of their gods. To a large extent, when thinking about antiquarian studies, that is actually what it is, because an antiquity or a ruin also has a lived presence. People live around them. Most of them, many of them, would actually think about these ruins in a different manner. So when you kind of record and document and try to do a scientific study on them, I think you lose out on many other histories, which we are only now trying to kind of pick up. The next slide. But from the 1830s, we actually see in India a kind of an earnest attempt at locating and excavating India's unknown history. And I've just thrown 3 slides of some of the foremost antiquaries, James Prinsep being the first. He first mapped Banaras. He's also somebody who deciphered the Brahmi and the Kharoshthi inscriptions, followed by the excavations of a stupa in Manikyala, which is in Punjab, Pakistan, by somebody called Jean-Baptiste Ventura, who was a mercenary in Ranjit Singh's army. And when Prinsep was in Banaras, that's when Alexander Cunningham comes to India, arrives in India in 1833, declares himself to be a disciple of Prinsep, and Alexander Cunningham dug at Sarnath. He actually opened the stupa at Sarnath in 1835. Alexander Cunningham declared himself to be an archaeologist. Literally somebody who was absolutely near his age, James Ferguson, at the same time declared himself to be an architectural historian. And Ferguson, I'm showing you a sketch. He took sketches with the camera lucida, and he published them these are actually lavishly illustrated in the picturesque architecture of Hindustan, where he says, and I quote him, that architecture was to show who the real people of India are, what was their former civilization, how far the present one may be purged of its absurdities, who in short are the people we have undertaken to govern. So you can see that here antiquarian survey is quite clearly linked with the colonial historiography, if we want to, if that's what we want to call it. But there are strands of this historiography. So there is a Ferguson, but there are other people who say other things about the antiquities. I pick up on these because these are the people who gets represented within the exhibition later on. This time, during this period, they also begin the journals. So journals are something which actually substantiate a discipline formation. And you have the journals of the Royal Asiatic Society of Bengal and the Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain and Ireland. The next one. And it's at this point that photography comes. So photography gets launched, and I use the word, in 1839 because the photographic technology had been worked at. And the fact that there's a technological leap which is made in the 1830s, this is made possible by the representational demands of certain revolutionary changes in the experiences of space, time, and subjectivity in Europe in the beginning of the 19th century. Has to do a lot with what was happening with the empires in Europe. And the 2 kinds of photographs which are kind of poised as the products of photography, as you all know, is the daguerreotype and the talbotype. And Henry Fox Talbot, who published his Pencil of Nature, he actually called photography the art of fixing the shadow. As he said, photography allows nature to draw images by its most subtle pencil, the ray of light. So The light, it's literally light which draws something on a sensitized paper. Next one. In the 1840s, coming back to India, there was a dispatch which came from London, and this dispatch was for and there is a history why this dispatch came, but it was for a general, comprehensive, uniform, and effective plan of operations based on scientific principles, which would pave the way towards the great object, that of the preservation and illustration of the monuments of India. After a couple of checkered attempts at trying to initiate the painting of certain caves, especially the caves of Elephanta by Fallon, the East India Company, always looking out for shortcuts and how to spend least amount of money, adopts photography. And the first photographers, and these are I'm just showing these because these are some of the first photographs of Indian monuments which are exhibited in the exhibition. So it's Thomas Biggs, who is given a camera and a Ross Dalmyer lens by the EIC in London. Biggs must have been a good photographer, but we really don't know the history of where he learned how to take photographs. But as you can see, his in the journals, his photography was greatly praised, and he also said that he began producing the calotype negatives. And I say it because at that point of time, they were also producing the daguerreotype. But the calotype actually became what we know today as photographs. It is those paper prints which comes up. And Biggs used this, and he said that he gave his prints a very smooth glaze with an agate of carnelian, he said, which brought out prominently the fine halftones and delicate details of the picture without any risk of the yellowing of the albumin egg yolks. But so what you see with Biggs, and then after Biggs, the next slide, is Pigou. Biggs is called back to the command, and he chooses his own successor, Pigou, who again was praised for photographing, as I said, under oblique lighting conditions to reveal the sculpted facade. The next one. And the uses of photography, for example, for presenting Indian landscape, also became one of the facts which was shown for promising or for showing the promise of the civilizing mission of the Britishers. And prominent among that is of Linnaeus Tripe's photography. Tripe was the first official photographer, or he was called the government photographer, and in this case of the Madras presidency, his letterpress, and that's why I've kind of put it there, because these are the photographic views of Madura. The letterpresses carry the description of the buildings, but then they say, they mention, and I could just kind of use a phrase of one of them is from Pudukottai, which says, everything which speaks, the photographs illuminate everything which speak in language that cannot be mistaken, that a brighter day had already dawned in India. So Tripe actually wanted his photography, and there is a section there about visual memory, about thinking in terms of photography would show that the British colonial enterprise in India, or the presence of the British in India, actually is a good thing. The next one. These are, while there were these individual army men who were taking photographs, there were also commercial firms. And I'm showing you this because this is one of the earlier ones we know of, Johnson and Henderson. And we have very little on the show of the early photographers who were Indians, natives. But while during 1854 and 1855, the photographic societies of Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta had been established. And you can see that these commercial firms actually worked with Indian photographers to produce this was the first production of actually views of India. And this was views of Bombay, of course, but these are Indian views. And the album literally presented the visible history of the Bombay presidency with its monuments and people, and it was published by a commercial firm. Many of these photographs then later on were used, of course, for antiquarian study of the caves of Elephanta or Amarnath, and much later for the conservation purposes. The next slide. And with commercial photographers, there were also men who were in other services like the medical services, or there were So the reason again, and I paused after saying medical services because I forgot what other services could have been there. But there were people who just took pictures. They were not all company men. And they may have been British, but John Murray he was in the medical service. But this kind of tells you something about who is the amateur and who is the antiquary, and who's the photographer, who's the amateur and who's the professional, who's the photographer, who's the antiquary, because these are distinctions which actually get quite blurred when we try to explore the histories of both photography and antiquarianism in India. The next one. Okay, just if you go back to John Murray, just to tell you that Murray's photographs of Agra, Banaras, and the northwest provinces are supposed to be the earliest photographs of these areas. So Agra, I think Murray is probably the first ones to take a photograph of the Taj. And Murray's negatives, which are, you can see them, they are the best preserved negatives of all the negatives collections in the 19th century, and they kind of show you the wealth of details which wax paper negatives could capture. Now, after the next slide. So the point about photography is that photographs soon became it became a valuable object of reference for vouching the truths that they supposedly showed. And I'm showing you, these two are also exhibited. So this is by Eugene Clutterbuck Impey. His archives are in Oxford, but the two photographs speak to each other because, and I better be clear about this, he says his views of the Qutub, which is numbered 8, which is that, he says it tells us that the one numbered 10 clearly shows the fact that the Hindus used the corbelling technique for creating the arch. The Hindus did not know how to do proper arches. So the point is, he's using these photographs to talk to each other to tell you that what he has thought in terms of what the Hindus knew or did not know about architectural history were truths. And at that point, the idea was that the Islamic rulers, wherever they went, they literally picked up the local areas of architectural knowledge, and they did that as an architecture. And Impey's photographs with his letterpresses actually tell you histories in the making, architectural histories in the making, through the use of photography and kind of thinking that these are telling the truth, so you might as well just see what's been told. Next. Yet, irrespective of photography's exuberance, and also, and I use the word exuberance because all the incidental details always seeped into the camera, however much you tried to frame it. Photography actually was often unable to penetrate the crevices, the dark, the hidden. And I think of a banyan tree, because that is something which there was a kind of a colonial psyche against the banyan tree. And I show you a photograph of Edmund Lyon, and this is in the exhibition, because Lyon actually painted, he inked the negative to show the sculptures quite clearly. He, of course, took the photograph by asking his workforce to use aluminium plates for the lights in a very dark corridor. And I show you the Girnar rock, which has got the Ashokan inscription, but it's the Junagadh one, so it's got the Skandgupta, also got Rudrasena's inscription on it and Skandgupta's inscription on it, where what they always thought in terms of what they always did, an estampage. Archaeologists still do an estampage. They chalk up the inscription and then they do the estampage, because photography has never been very good for taking inscriptions, for actually lifting the inscription out of its rock. And I'm reminded here of one of the first books on archaeology which came out, Methods and Methods and Principles of Archaeology by Flinders Petrie, an Egyptologist who actually instructed his workforce to chalk up the hieroglyphs so that they would come out. The next one. By photography, of course, created systematic fieldwork. And one of the first examples of that, which is there in the exhibition, and which is in the exhibition, is the photographs of John Burke. And you can see the scale. And I've deliberately chosen a photograph where you can barely see the scale. But the scale, actually, you can see it propped up against the wall, and you can see it horizontal. The scale becomes one of the key elements of an archaeological photograph. And I'm showing you a photograph from excavations at Harappa taken by Mortimer Wheeler, where Mortimer Wheeler literally created the whole idea of showing systematic work in the field, because you are actually creating a scientific stuff. The next slide, and I know I'm running over time, so I'm going to just throw them very quickly, but this is kind of a photographic history of Sanchi. And you see, the first Sanchi was explored by Cunningham, and Cunningham had declared in his book on the Bhilsa Topas that the plans and sections were all drawn from careful measurements on the same scale so that the eye can compare the disposition of one group from the other. Sanchi was photographed a decade later by James Waterhouse, and you can see Waterhouse had trouble taking pictures there. His plates cracked, the collodium got dried too quickly, and then what all these kind of the grievances which photographers came up with, which we read, actually tell us is that all added to the need for sustained experimentation of the photographic apparatus, technologies, and chemicals, which is what happened till the 1880s. And it slowed down from the 1870s, but it went on till the 1880s. The next one. Sanchi, of course, then became the feat of photography, and I want you to see that, where the camera was actually hoisted on a scaffold. And Henry Cousins, in 1900, between January and March, he was able to create every instance, a photographic model of each of the Toranas with 200 prints to the scale of 1/8 of the original. And this becomes a kind of a feat. It's a rare feat which happened. Sanchi also then becomes a place for showing off the conservation efforts, which you see with Deen Dayal's photos, which is after the repair. The next slide. And the first photos of Sanchi and Amravati went into the tree and serpent worship. I'm showing you, it's one of the seminal architectural books where the reviewer, very unkind to James Ferguson, decides that he has also seen characteristic native heads in the sculptures of the Amravati dome, and he says that these photographs, which are taken for architectural purposes, should be studied for ethnological purposes. The next slide. And I show you the archive, because it's only by creating distinguishing archives between archaeological and the ethnological that they also created discipline. So discipline making happened with archive making. But once these archives were made, and I'm showing you the making of the archive, of the British Library, the collections which are there in the British Library, was actually made at the injunctions of this report by Forbes Watson of the illustrations of the archaic architecture, where they said, it specified that the photographs needed to be 8 by 10 inches. The photographer had to stand on somewhere else to take a view, etc., etc. And the arrows kind of tell you what the injunctions are. But once the archive comes, you can take the field indoors. And that's what Ferguson did. He wrote all his books in London, but he had a cache of 3,000 photographs to kind of look at. So you could linger on the moments, you could linger on time, you could linger on time past, you could linger on the rinse, you could compare. And the best thing about it is, if you have all these photographs of the same size, you could just touch them, flick them with your hands, you can sort them, and then once you put them in a cabinet, you can have the veracity of your sorting and classification as kind of, yeah, that's there. But the point that you've been doing this, you've been creating these schemes, it becomes very easy to do so with photographs than with anything, or it became very easy to do so with photographs. And the last slide is with photographs. Also, as we trace the development of photography, we not only trace the development of the disciplines of architectural histories, I would say, and archaeology, but also actually history. Because remember, ancient Indian history was not written down in the 19th century. I mean, all these books which we are kind of think about, history books, they started coming up. The first one was by Alexander Dow in 1840, but they started coming up from 1870s. And what we see here are the photographs of buildings which were taken before, and some of them are by unidentified people. They started circulating. So this book on the Hindus and the Hindu civilization, published in Paris, I think this is a tribe photograph, but I do not know. But these are photographs which are there. The photograph which it uses is in the British Library, reproduced here, to kind of just tell you how this history making happens. And can you do the next? I'm not sure if, yeah, I did that. I wasn't sure about the last slide. Because then increasingly, stereoscopes, lantern slides, and subsequently postcards took the Indian architecture and archaeological fields to places far away, and for more Indian histories to be made. And I'll leave it at that. Okay? Thank you.
So when we come to the exhibition, we see it upstairs, and it is divided in that way. For you, as a scholar curating it today, was there a decolonial attempt? And Giles, also from the point of view of organizing the exhibition, as there is a stream of exhibitions you are organizing, looking at these histories, where do you think, from an exhibitionary point of view, because exhibitions become a very big part of how these images are circulating. From an exhibitionary point of view today, how does one look at, archives? Is not only of photography. And, of course, a lot of the journals that we're looking at from the 19th century come laden with maps, they come laden with lithographs, there are travel documents. The word globetrotter itself is invented in the 19th century, and you touch upon this because you head into postcard culture. So the archaeology of knowledge is, of course, a quote taken from Michel Foucault. And I was kind of feeling a little reassured at this moment of time of talking about Foucault, because you began with Areala Azule.
Thank you, Rahab. And you see my look. So Foucault and archaeology of knowledge, it's all about stratigraphy as well. And I speak as an archaeologist here, right? It's the stratigraphy, it's time, it's layering, it's what's hidden, it's what's masked, it's what's made visible, it's what can be, there can be a texture to it, rupture happens. But then there is also, in terms of raw histories, we think in terms of, say, what I would recall Elizabeth Edwards' work, and I would recall things like the punctum and the studium, which is what a photograph does to you, right? So you recall Barthes, and then you recall John Berger, and then you leave Foucault behind. So I'm coming to leaving Foucault behind, because I think your question about, and I'm coming back to your question about decolonial. Photographs are something in an exhibitionary complex. It's very difficult. I think it's always very difficult to convey the complex in its complex form. But we need to do that. And I strongly believe in it, because I don't think histories are simple. So a 19th century photograph in an Indian venue becomes the place for saying, oh yes, these are colonial photographs. And actually, as I say today, my own university has kind of touted this exhibition as saying, come, see, ma'am has put on colonial photography on show. That's not the point. Because archives are the places, and archives are also the places for the lost things. So what we are losing out here, and we only have Deen Dayal to show, but there is Narayan Daji, there is your vernacular photography as you brought in a way. There is a whole range of people, because photography actually was a leveler. So women who were considered unscientific and natives who were considered unscientific were allowed to join the photographic societies from 1854 and 1855, and I can trace you who they were. That's why I tried to show you Mirwanji Bomanji, right? And they could show their stuff with the so-called officers of the East India Company or whatever. They got prizes. They could sell their stuff at the same rate as other people did. So in a way, it was a leveler. But what one does see with the picturesque, for example, which there is a very strong colonialist historiography, is that the Indians used the picturesque to sell their stuff. Photography, after all, was a commercial enterprise. So it's not this art, etc. we are talking about, and the whole debate about photography as an art and science spills across, and I think cuts across these very unilinear theories of antiquarian developments of antiquaries. So I began by saying I'm making something simple. But even the beginnings of archaeology or antiquarianism or whatever, we still have antiquaries amongst us. And if we actually look at histories of historicizing disciplines, histories of historicizing technology, histories of historicizing photographs, and the social histories of photograph, we find ourselves looking out for things which we have thrown along the way. And we pick them up, and then we realize that these colonialist the strands of historiography which we make, they are not very simple. They need to be paired. And I have actually addressed it in many other ways, in other books, etc. And the decolonial, the way I think about it is, it's a decolonizing the mind. So it's, it's like, it's not us and them. And I think the decolonial for me, and I'm being I'm being a historian here, an academic historian here, is that we need to kind of decolonize the mind by thinking through the ways in which these archives are formed. So the histories of archives, histories of practice, histories of discipline allow us to actually think about certain methods we may formulate in order to bring an equity in the ways in which we write and we engage with other scholars. So I take decolonization, I take the decolonial very differently. Yeah?
So your question to me was about my strategies, as it were, as the person responsible for promoting the exhibitions in the first place. Well, the short answer is that on seeing the kind of wonderful, rich material that we had in this area, in the DHA archive, was to think that I'm not going to do this myself. I need to get a curator who is an Indian curator who's going to take a suitably theorized approach to historical photography, hence Sudeshna, and my job is just to, as it were, to assist. But I think there's more to it than that. I think that there would have been a problem for me with this exhibition, but for some of the material that we haven't touched on so much. You did talk a little bit about Laladin Dayal, and the Indian photographers. Yes. But if we had restricted ourselves to, say, the early field archaeologists, the people who were actually, whether they were military men or whatever, who were appointed specifically by the Bombay government to take photographs of these monuments, so we're talking about Pigu, and Neil, and then later people like Waterhouse and Impey, and we'd left it at that, then I think there would have been a problem. And for me, part of the question of the tying of the practice of photography to the discipline, if I just pursue that thought for a minute, then I'll come back to what I think is the kind of anti-colonial turn in the exhibition. You put on the screen for a moment a remark by James Ferguson, where he talks about having 3,000 photographs. And I just want to rub in, as it were, to unpack what that means. Because James Ferguson, in a later book that he wrote, The History of Indian and Eastern Architecture, which is 1876, really is the first attempt by anyone to do an analytical narrative history of Indian architecture. Now, that may sound an appalling thing to say, but I'm afraid it's true. Not every literary genre exists in every civilization at every time. And although if you look in the earlier 19th century, you might find a wonderful author like Ramraz, a magistrate in Bangalore, who wrote a book called Architecture of the Hindus, actually commissioned by the Royal Asiatic Society. He's not being an art historian, he's being an architectural theorist, and there's a difference. What the architectural historian does, and I speak as somebody who was formerly one, is you try to make connections between buildings. You try to say, well, there's a form here that's similar to one there, and this suggests to me a transmission of knowledge from one place to the other. I now have to work out which direction it was transmitted in, and so on and so forth. Now, I've tried to do this myself in the field. You go and you think, oh, that's a very familiar arch. I've seen that somewhere before. What am I going to do? Am I going to walk back through every previous site until I find it? Or am I going to look at my photographs? Obviously, you take photographs as you go, and that's what Ferguson did, 3,000 photographs. So that the field, a term we've used a great deal this evening, becomes your carpet.
Yeah.
You have India spread out before you on your carpet in 3,000 images, and you just play snap until you've got a history of Indian architecture. It's not to say he got it all right, because obviously ever since then, people have been contesting his interpretation and rewriting it, but he, as it were, was able to establish it. So I think what I'm getting to is if we're just taking it that far, then indeed it would have simply been a colonial narrative. But as you go round the exhibition, you suddenly find, and you've already mentioned this, that the picturesque, quintessentially, supposedly, a colonial vision of India, is also a very fashionable one. And Laladin Dayal makes a fortune out of it. Yeah. So does, we were much less known, but now rediscovered, Babu Jageshwar Prasad of Benares. It's not only Samuel Bourne who's photographing the gaps of Benares, it's
Him.
Babu Jageshwar Prasad. But then we get to a really sort of wonderful sort of fight-back moment with Virka taking photographs of Raigad. And it's very, very clear that he's promoting images of Raigad as the stronghold of Shivaji at just the point at which the colonial authorities are trying to restrict access to Shivaji's Samadhi because they think that there's going to be this appalling cult of Shivaji worship that they've got to kind of stamp out. So photography is there being used as a tool of pushback. And then the next kind of leap, I think, in the narrative that you tell, and we were working this out as you went through the archive. You know, we found more and more of this material and realized that the richness of the story to tell is at the end of the 19th century into the 20th century. Instead of these photographs being produced for the kind of scholarly publications which you saw a few images of, I mean, they're still doing that. The new Imperial series that's produced under Marshall is all early 20th century. But they start being used for postcards by the million. And so there's a chapter in the book by Omar Khan, who's a well-known collector and curator of postcards. The numbers are simply staggering. So that instead of it being read by a few people who can afford the £1,000 for an incredibly expensive publication, these things that cost an anna are being sent all over the world, being consumed everywhere. And so there's this extraordinary kind of democratization of knowledge about Indian architecture. And I think that it's those two turns in the exhibition, as it were, that are the answer to your question.
Right. They do. I mean, I'm glad we got that out of the way. So the reason I came back to it in a way, an exhibitionary practice as a whole, because a lot of these photographs are being exhibited maybe in books, they're being published in that way. Or exhibited in shows and such like. We'll come to that, I want to come to that. But also to clarify that, you know, in the 19th century, as Sudeshna has shown upstairs, you never had the opportunity to make reproductions. You had to show an actual photograph in a book, because reproduction only came at the end of the 19th century through half-tone printing. So, and that is why there was this incredible boom also in postcard culture, which starts in Vienna, which, of course, Omar writes extensively about. But there's an interesting transaction there as well. The exhibitions I find fascinating, and I think you refer to them in the exhibition above. I think it'll be nice to know about the histories of some of these
1851 is when photography was just kind of coming up, right? So they couldn't make that many photos, and the technology was cumbersome. 1867 is actually when Indian photographs were shown, and Linus Stripe's photographs were shown there, and this was an exhibit. I mean, there's a long history behind this, but James Ferguson organized the collection of photographs from India. James Waterhouse's Sanchi was shown, Biggs, Pigou, they were all shown. And guess what? They were shown in the section called Labor, Travailler. And so it is the Indian labor which is there. These are monuments which are shown. Indian photographs, and I unfortunately have gone through most of the journal of photography. So some of them were kind of lauded for their brilliance, some were lauded for, oh, this country has got fascinating ruins, etc. But at the end of it, there were also some princes from Europe. They decided that they were going to take facsimiles. They were going to take plaster casts of Indian monuments and get the European world acquainted with that. So the Sanchi Torana, the Eastern Torana of Sanchi is of course one of the first casualties, I say for it, which is today doing a kind of a bridge in Berlin between the East and the West in the Humboldt Forum. So I think that photographic facsimile of Sanchi is kind of an answer to one of that. However, showing these photographs abroad, this also started getting them thinking in terms of discovering ancient Indian history. So you have these photographers who become gentlemen scholars, many of them, and they do this. Somebody who does it is Harichand Chintaman, who has a commercial firm in Bombay. It goes on till 1883. If I'm not mistaken, if John was here, he would have said 1881. I can never remember if it was 1881 or 1883. But they all actually produce these booklets of photographs with histories of India. So, then the question here is, that's when we do that's what I come back to your earlier question as well, that it's so difficult to kind of trace a kind of a single history of a development of a discipline. These people were also making histories. Their stuff was being bought by people on the streets. there were hawkers, for example, who were, used to get these little booklets later on to the people.
I want to also ask you, Giles, because it reminds me of Messrs. Futcher and Stroud. It reminds me of, Thomas Holbein Henley and all the work that was done in Jaipur, for instance. And the reason I want to bring up this question of maybe archaeology, architecture, and photographs thereof, of them, is that what is the connection in your mind, and I'm sure there is one, between also the representations of traditional arts and crafts in these industrial arts exhibitions? After all, they're being juxtaposed. Architecture is being juxtaposed with trade and craft and such like. So what is this antiquarian space beginning to mean within colonial historiography, within an exhibitionary space, and maybe with reference to spaces even like Jaipur, which had so many of these industrial arts exhibitions as well?
Yeah, no, your question made me think of Jaipur, of course. It doesn't take much to make me think of Jaipur. But so 1883 is the Jaipur exhibition. It's an industrial arts exhibition, the function of which is to promote Jaipur as a leading centre of artistic creativity in industrial arts. So things like enamelling, for example, or brassware and all sorts of things. So yes, photography has two roles in an exhibition like that. It's used to illustrate the catalogue, memorial catalogue. So every single object
was photographed
by actually military engineering photographers who are hired especially for the purpose. But photography is also a category within the exhibition, and indeed that's what brings Vladimir Dayal to Jaipur. That's his first visit, and he exhibits in that exhibition, and indeed wins the medal in photography. So it's a category all on its own, as well as a helpful medium. And I think that actually, for me, points to a bit of the story that remains to be told, which is the importance of Indian photography in Indian states. Why Jaipur will, most obviously, because of course Jaipur had a Maharaja who was a photographer in the 1860s and 70s. So he's before the exhibition. I mean, it's his idea, but he doesn't live to see it. I, for a while, thought that it was him who brought Vladimir Dayal to the dates don't work out, unfortunately. But you see, Sawai Ram Singh as a photographer wouldn't fit upstairs at all. I mean, we've worked on exhibitions together on Sawai Ram Singh. He's a very different kind of photographer. He does sometimes photograph in the streets, but he's not photographing monuments. It's a very different kind of photographic view, and I think that story, I mean, obviously there are not very many of them, but there are other early commercial companies that need further investigation.
Tripura, the Maharaja of Tripura, Debarman was one of them. But princely states is one of them. But also, I remember that one of the platinum prints were hand-colored and then sold off. So, there are many stories of this, but one thing with the JJ School of Art, the Bombay School of Art, the schools of art which came up in 1854, they used photographs for jali, etc. to make design. And I was reminded of this by Christine Michael, who's a potter specialist of ceramics, and she said, so they would cut these photographs, they would cut some of the parts of the photographs, the monuments, jalis, some architectural element, and the students would be given those to draw and create design. So there is a history of photography, and it's the skill, right? Photography is also crafts. Photography is not great art. So I think there is this crafts history which is tied to it in a very big way in the exhibitionary space.
But hang on, in the JJ school you said they're using photography as an aid to design.
As an aid to design.
In the Jaipur School of Art, they were teaching photography from the 1860s.
Yeah. They were much more higher up. And the Bombay, but Elphinstone did so because the first photography course came up in Elphinstone College in Bombay, but they shut it down because of the
lack of funds.
Because of the mutiny, 1857. Then, of course, the lack of funds, and students. So Hari Chand Chintaman was the first student of that first batch.
What struck me in the exhibition upstairs, and which I found extremely, drawn into, and I think your catalogue also mentions it, certainly the wall text does, are those linear aerial views, the panoramas. I was thinking about what they mean in the context of archaeology and architecture, because they give you this sense of continuance, they give you this sense of time, and timelessness. And of course, we know that the Beato, the famous one, is in the aftermath of the uprising, where he's looking at a state of abandonment and curfew. So how do you position those wonderful views, those extraordinary views, at this difficult time in the making of history in India? And what does it actually tell you about this so-called discourse about the melding of architecture and archaeology? What does that linear aerial view tell you about a history that is being written at the time? Because one of the things you mentioned distinctly, I think, again, I was reading this upstairs very quickly, is that photography gives you, in the 19th century, that sense of history of something being taken at that moment in time, right? But it is also a perception of that moment in time. Can you bring the two together for us?
Well, Beato's photos, as you know, Rahab, very well, are peopleless, and it shows the brutality of the uprising. Unlike what he wanted to kind of show, because he was this documentary photographer who took these great he was really, really skillful in making these panoramic images. But just to kind of jump through your question and do the connection with archaeology, archaeologists don't really take panorama. Archaeologists actually focus on the trench. I mean, when we talk about today's archaeologists. But yes, they both take people-less images, because the minute you put people inside that, then it just kind of foils the idea of a clean trench, which has been absolutely spruce cleaned so that you can see facts on the ground. So I can pun it around and say, yes, Beato shows us facts on the ground. There were people-less people because the people had been killed or they had been thrown out of Delhi. But archaeology's people-less stuff is very different. I mean, that is kind of doing, the photography is used for doing science. Both of them, of course, and you pick up the question of time, but it's also space, because it shows space in a different, I mean, the idea of space also changes when you kind of see these empty places. You have a camera which has been pivoted at different places. The light has to be the same at all the time, so that when you put these albumin prints together, cut them together and neatly paste them together, they all look as if it's been taken at the same time. You know, you have to be very, very skillful at this. And archaeological photographs also need you to kind of take them at a certain time so that the shadow comes at a certain point. I mean, I can go on and on about the use of archaeological photography. But time, photographs in itself, it allows you to linger at something which has just gone by. So in a way, photograph actually, I always think it kind of captures for us, for the now, for the future, the imprint of the past. And they do it in a brilliant way, all of them. So I don't think it answers your question, but because these are two different things. But the people-less cleaned up space, or seeing something from the top, for the panorama allows you to kind of look into certain nooks and crevices from the top, because you can't do it at the length in which you take photos. That kind of a scrutiny of photography comes up in, and I could show so many photographs of Indian excavations undertaken in India from the time of, and I would say from John Marshall's period, despite the fact that Marshall's photographs were not as clear-cut scientific photographs as Wheeler's were, because Wheeler made them to be, but that is what was demanded of archaeological photographs.
Extraordinary. No, I also wanted to just insert over here that a lot of the time, we mentioned Beato, so we think of other photographers in the Crimea and such like. So it is true that they have come, but they have also come via the Middle East.
Yeah.
They've also come via Constantinople. They've also come via Turkey and such like. So there is a kind of tracing of the biographies of these photographers, which doesn't position them just in India or the subcontinent.
Beato wasn't at all.
And so, you know, I guess one of my last questions would be, it's kind of forked. One is about looking at these histories, which one might see as subcontinental histories, and how does that fit within, you know, this idea of South Asia today? Do you find that, you know, a similar kind of survey was happening in other parts? Do you find that 19th century material is deployed and redeployed and thought of again and again and brought and sort of investigated or scrutinized in the way that you're thinking and writing the history from today's perspective? I mean, is this still raw material, fresh?
Yeah.
Or is it all been written out?
Are you asking me?
I'm asking the both of you. Yes.
Well, I think as an architectural historian, I first started to look at early photography as it were, something more proximate, something removed from me or closer, to show me what a building looked like, particularly in areas of rapid urbanization, where historic buildings are often destroyed or damaged or altered. In using them in that way, of course, one's assuming that they have a kind of level of innocence, which is problematic. But yes, one inevitably does use historic photography in that way. I mean, you think of the structural changes made in the Agra Fort. Sadly, we don't have photographs of the Delhi Red Fort before the uprising. That would be fantastically useful to have. I don't know of any. Do you? There
are just a few that we have, which are by Murray, I think, which are taken just the year before.
1858.
This is the year before, 56. I think there's a wax paper negative that we have.
Of Delhi. He's supposed to be the earliest photographer of Delhi.
And it shows basically the areas that are being lived in around the Red Fort, right? It's not abandoned, it's a lived-in space. Sudeshna,
Okay, so, I can go into the history of this, but I will not. But just to tell you that photography began in India pretty quickly, right? The photography of all the places, photography came here and photography was used instantly. 1839, the daguerreotype, it's announced by December 1839. They have translated in Bengali the French pamphlet of how to do daguerreotype in Calcutta. So it happens very quickly. But when it comes to Sri Lanka, areas of Sri Lanka, Pakistan, of course, was part of British India. Afghanistan was also John Burke. He goes to Afghanistan. But with Sri Lanka, it happens a little later because it comes up in 1860 with the formation of, again, the antiquarian stuff, okay, and the formation of the archaeological survey there. So one can trace the history of this, of photography coming into South Asia in a different way. But I don't think of histories as South Asia. I think we need to break out of this mold. As you reminded us, Beato came, he was probably a Cypriot Greek, or he's considered an Italian, which he was not. He comes from Crimea, he goes off to China to do the Opium War, he sets up shop in Burma, and he dies there. Basically. So many of these photographers had a life which was very cosmopolitan life. They came from somewhere or the other. And it's a bit like how I would think in terms of, that the painting of Captain Modern's cockfight. So they come from Switzerland, France, they don't know where they are, when they go back, the home doesn't remind them of home, and they are homeless within their home. So that's that story. And in terms of thinking about a history of a discipline, I have written on this for archaeology, is the Nineveh marbles, which comes from, and there's a whole chapter on this called Nineveh in Bombay, because these marbles, which are the excavations of Layard, which come via Bombay, people in Bombay want to see it, the marbles get stuck there, then Layard accuses the citizens of Bombay of pilfering his stuff, and then these Assyrian objects actually start making architectural histories for the Indians. And the Indians say, this looks like how the Deccan Maharaja's horse would have been like. And we have these, I also don't like the word vernacular, but we do have these local histories which are coming up. And at that point of time, 1840, history was also used for a moralizing mission, and the Nineveh marbles played a part in it. So I think we need to look at a bigger world to even do a little local history of anything. And I would leave it at that. And photography is something, photographs, and because the photographs circulate, they just slip in and out through Suez. And you can just think of these little things just going out from pockets to somewhere or the other. They're mobile. And histories are also mobile. So we should not be doing, and that's me again speaking as a historian, is limit ourselves to a certain region or a certain country while writing something, because we need to know how those regions or how those landscapes got historicized. And photography allows us to look through that, to think through that.